there's a lot we can talk about. The Sauce Labs of 2020 and 2021 exists in a completely different world than 2010, 2015, and 2019, where we started with a focus on Selenium. So as part of your role, how do you see the influences on the market and overall influences on software changing and really guiding us to a different future?
Yeah, it's a great question, Matt. One of the great things about being in this role is I get to talk to customers all the time, and you get to see what are the large and small enterprises up to, what's pressuring them, what's changing. And over and over and over again, it's really one theme. It's speed, speed, speed. Customers want to push smaller increments of change into production at higher and higher rate. This is how they deliver value in a changing market as their own businesses shift. Their customers enjoy this value. They need to push faster and faster and faster. Part of what that creates, though, is pressure on testing. Selenium testing or integration testing, just before deploy is a fairly long process. And customers are now saying, well, the responsibility for tests is now everyone in the SDLC. Everyone needs to help. Developers need to do this type of testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're seeing is a lot of different quality signals coming in. So test is quote unquote shifting left, but it's also shifting right. And this is very interesting, into production. Customers are putting things into production maybe before they're fully baked. Maybe they're using various tools like feature flagging, et cetera, to limit the blast radius, but get it into production quickly and then have safety nets so they can bring things back to the teams and get them going again. So these types of changes have really shaken up the quality world. And so I think what you're seeing is that the craft of quality, it's in flux.
Do you think this is just a matter of organizations becoming more deliberate in how they're approaching quality, or is there something else going on there?
Well, I think organizations have always been deliberate about quality, but the way they were doing it in the past, I think it just isn't sufficient now. You can't spend a long time doing an integration test when you're doing multiple deploys per day, when you want to push out continuously. And so what we're seeing is organizations saying, A, I want many, many quality signals during my SDLC, but B, if my pipelines are well structured, if I have strong processes that are very, very modern, I can actually take on quite a bit of risk. I can push things into production and things can work out fine.
So risk, what kind of risk are you specifically talking about?
Well, I literally mean the risk of pushing code into production when it isn't ready, which of course sounds crazy. But if I know that I can push it into code, I can push it into production quickly, and I can get a quick feedback loop when my customers run into problems, such that things get back to my developers and are quickly fixed and pushed back out into production, I can limit my risk and I can be confident that it's worthwhile and that that's a better choice than delaying the delivery of value.
Do you think that risk is something that not just developers are thinking about? Do you think the business persona and other people are also now more willing because of the way in which we're doing experimentation and growth? Do you think more people are willing to take on those risks?
I think they're actually demanding of their teams to take on these risks, right? Once the business personas figure out that this is possible, then they want it, right? And we know that CI and CD have changed software, but we also know that to a certain extent, CI and CD emerged in response to that need. The business persona is pushing and saying, I need to deliver value more quickly in smaller increments. How do we do that? And teams responded with better process and fundamentally with the ability to enable many independent people to work together on a project independently through the modern CI/CD practices. And Matt, I know that you in particular actually have a really deep understanding of CI because of your background. You're also responsible for engineering here at Sauce. You've told me in the past, and please elaborate on this, that modern development practices don't just increase speed, they also increase quality. Now that sounds like a contradiction. If you can, it seems like you can have one, you can have the other, but you can't have them both. How is it that this modern development practice has changed that?
It takes many people to write the software, but the environment in which it's being written is constantly changing because of the number of people that are writing it. And so if you're going to validate that each unit of change is successful, you want to keep the conditions for success as close to the original conditions of creation as possible. And the longer you wait and the conditions of creation start to expand, then the harder the validation problem is. In fact, you might have to restart it and just start over and start over and start over. And frankly, all of us can remember those times where we've had that experience years ago when in exploratory testing, when people had to test long batches and they had to start over and retry things. So you want your batches as small as possible because you want to maintain the initial conditions of change and therefore move it all the way through. And so then this also links to this notion of testing production, because of course, if everyone's pushing to production constantly, then this means that your change has to be picked up and moved across to production as quickly as you can make the change. This is why a lot of modern organizations are thinking about cycle time as an example, and that's a whole nother conversation, but it's why we're thinking about these closed loops and how quickly can we get around these closed loops? How quickly can we get something into production? It also starts to shift how we think about our methodology for validation and for quality. So, and you and I have talked about this a lot. One can argue that there are these two methods: intent-based validation and behavior-based validation. So intent-based validation is really based on the requirements. And it's a big if someone could somehow perfectly write every requirement, then you could write a test that covers every permutation. However, one, very few people can write every single requirement. And two, it's expensive to write every permutation because you hit diminishing returns pretty quickly. So intent-based is valuable, but it's most valuable when paired with behavior-based. And where do you get your best behaviors? You get behaviors in production or as close to production as possible. Maybe it's a staging environment, especially if you're in financial services, certain organizations, it doesn't make sense to go all the way to production. But as close as you can get to the real world is where you find out about true behavior and how something actually is going to operate. And so what this has done is it's created the emergence of these two methodologies where now we're not thinking about how many tests can we run. We're trying to think of what's the outcome and how few can we run of each type, such that we get the coverage in terms of cases, not coverage in terms of code, but coverage in terms of cases as possible. And so certainly something we've been seeing with customers and ourselves is taking a lot of the automation suites, if you will, and starting to look at them carefully and say, well, would an API test be more effective in this moment? Would a visual regression test be more effective in this moment? Should we do component-based testing, like functional component testing, and then layer on top of that integration testing? And so here you see, again, the signals are starting to expand. And then a very nice, well, what's appearing to be a very nice line between intent, where someone wrote code, they know what it was supposed to do, they write the intent in the validation, and then another set of signals around behavior coming back around the loop. And I think maybe we'll talk more about it later, but Test Fairy in particular in the mobile space includes with it error reporting and captures cases in a distributed application. So you can see what really happened when a person had a device and was working with a device in the real world. And it creates a nice closed loop, which is, I think, where a large part of testing is going. And it's really about deliberately structuring these signals. Maybe you can give some examples of how this all comes together in your mind.
Well, of course, we've been talking about this all year long. We've been talking with customers, and we've taken a very intentional strategy this year to think about what are the different quality signals that our customers need? What are the different personas who need access to these signals? Which of those signals come in the development process? Which of them come in the testing environment? Which of them come in production? How can we put them all together? How does Sauce inevitably provide a complete testing solution that goes across both test methodologies? That's a lot to ask for, but that's the path we're trying to go down. And this helps explain the work that we've done in the last year. For example, Sauce Control, which enables really early development testing with different testing frameworks like Playwright, Puppeteer, Test Cafe, Cypress, et cetera, right? The ability to give early testing capabilities to that persona and then marry that up to other types of testing, later Selenium testing, for example, and then visual end-to-end, right? Not just component testing, but also even end-to-end testing in case there are visual regressions. But then we went out and we also made some acquisitions. Pretty exciting year for us, right? We bought Autonomic, and I'll ask you to talk about Autonomic maybe a little bit later, we'll see. And then API Fortress. Of course, you mentioned API testing just a minute ago, right? We know the problem for QA folks and other testers. They have a test failure and it's probably related to some API. They can't go any further, right? But they need to collaborate with developers on that problem in order to solve that problem quickly and get it into market. So these are little examples of the kinds of loops that these additional signals provide and the kind of collaboration amongst different personas as everyone tries to move faster. And then of course you mentioned TestFairy, right? TestFairy allows beta distribution for mobile apps together with error reporting so that end users can use those beta apps and exercise them with real usage. And when there is a crash or an issue, that gets shipped back to the developer and the testing teams, and we get quick feedback loops. And it's all about these loops. It's about multiple personas collaborating together. It's about the many signals. And this is how you create speed. This is how you make sure that things move nicely through the process in a continuous fashion, right? There's this myth, of course, that shifting right is the right way to create quality, but it really doesn't. What it does is it accelerates signals, right? And you've talked a little bit to me about this in the past. So tell me what you mean by accelerating signals.
As people embrace these newer techniques, what they're finding is it's not just a matter of getting a signal. It's not good enough just to know that something happened. You need to be able to refine it and understand and go backwards on your loop to understand, okay, where did it originate? Can I back chain to the moment in time in which there was a validation around it? What validations were run? What did those validations tell me? Can you get all the way back to code? A year ago at SauceCon, we announced failure analysis, which was an ML mechanism that cohorts error logs and outputs and puts them together and can tell you which tests are flaky, can also tell you which API endpoints are flaky where you need some testing. And that's a good example of where you can improve your overall loop and your overall cycle if you're able to turn the data that's happening in production into something actionable and really collaborate around it. And we've talked about this with many customers. A big part of our strategy going forward here is not only to provide people a mechanism to disentangle some of the different validation outcomes they're trying to get to using different techniques, as you mentioned, whether it was visual or native framework or whatnot. So it's not only to do that, but also to create a consistent, deeply integrated platform where you can actually collaborate and many different people can engage and collaborate. And I think this is one of the keys in our strategy going forward. It's not all about only one persona. There are many personas that are involved. Already SDETs and QE and QA are deeply involved in this area, but we're also seeing developers. We're starting to see designers. We're starting to see business analysts. We're starting to see additional people that care about software quality as a whole. It's not just about pace. It's also about the collaboration. Maybe I'll use this moment to talk about where we're going. So we've made these acquisitions and we have all sorts of new products. And right now it's loosely coupled, but what we expect to see, and we expect you to see over the next 18 months is all these pieces start to come together, to be tighter and tighter and tighter, where we can start to provide those capabilities across different areas, start to interconnect so that we can have, as an example, I just mentioned designers, so we can have, for example, a designer that comes in and run tests. At the same time, we're also recognizing that platform for quality in your SDLC is distinct from another set of requirements around the business application. Many quality organizations are being asked to start testing not only as they have traditionally with SDLCs and all the changes that we've been talking about involved there, but they're also being asked to test business applications that are written on Salesforce, SAP, ServiceNow, and elsewhere. And the types of folks who are engaged in that activity and building those business applications tend not to be developers. They tend to be SMEs. They are thinking about cash to close as an example in Salesforce. And they're utilizing these pre-made application platforms, if you will, to build critical business systems that need to be tested. And this is where Autonomic comes in. So Autonomic allows us to extend all the wonderful capabilities of automation to a citizen tester. It allows you to use natural language to write a test. The tests are self-healing. And so it's using some deep AI and ML to understand what we like to term these walled gardens, because of course, the Salesforce environment is a environment that has specific guardrails around it. It's not an arbitrarily written application. It's an application that has specific rules. And so it's a very good example of where you can take AI and ML and apply it. So Autonomic understands Salesforce. It understands ServiceNow and SAP. And therefore, you can build some deep automation and testing in those environments. So why going down that path? Well, what we're seeing is that there's an opportunity for these two, what seem to be separate paths, to come together a bit, where a lot of the same capabilities that are needed in testing the business applications are also needed, but in a different form on the SDLC side. And so, as you mentioned, John, as we're looking forward at how pace of business is changing, we're also seeing this opportunity to bring these two different methodologies of intent-based and behavior-based together, also using two different technical capabilities, SDLC-based and this business application-based.
Yeah, what I find so interesting about Autonomic is that it's scriptless, right?
That's great.
There's been a lot of discussion over the last few years about whether or not scriptless would overcome scripted testing. And of course, we've always used code to test code. That's what automation in software testing has always been about. And yet Autonomic is scriptless. How should we think about that going forward as the entire industry moves forward in these two different tracks?
Well, let me turn this back to you just for a moment, because for years people have said, appropriately in my opinion, look, record and playback is risky. And some people might say it doesn't work, but certainly it's risky because, well, frankly, the code base changes, the applications change, and suddenly everything breaks. So maybe you can talk a little bit with your background in AI. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why we think what amounts to a record and playback tool will work.
Well, what's interesting is, we've obviously kept an eye on the world of scriptless testing. It's important, it's interesting, and we've sort of been waiting for it to get mature. And what we've discovered was, in a walled garden, a world of, let's say, Salesforce apps, SAP apps, et cetera, as you mentioned, the guardrails are already there, right? You can actually use AI/ML to fully explore that garden, shall we call it, to do feature extraction, to understand all the possible permutations, which are of a limited number, right? And therefore be very good at taking a natural language description of, here's the process I need to go through for my cache to close, for example. Or I'm going to explore this app with record and playback, but the AI/ML models already know the walled garden pretty well, and so it's not going to get confused as I go through. And so what we're finding is very, very high fidelity testing can be done within those universes with AI/ML, and it's entirely scriptless. And what's really important is the maintainability of those tests. It's always been possible to do record and playback. It's always been possible to do scriptless, et cetera. But when small changes happen in the application, either by internal developers or by your Salesforce or SAP, et cetera, they break and everything's wrong. now that we have something like Autonomic, which can really well explore that world and has really advanced techniques that are purpose-built for this world, we have highly maintainable tests. And that's really wonderful. But really what it came down to was, in the end, for us, as we explored whether or not to go into this market, as you say, there's a whole need for that. And Selenium and other types of scripted testing, they're really the wrong tool for the job, right? So
For the business application job.
the business application,
okay.
yeah.
Because they're the right tool for the SDLC.
Of course, well, they're necessary there because, as you mentioned, they're custom, right? They're completely arbitrary to an extent, and they are code that should be tested with code in collaboration with many other signals in the SDLC, in collaboration with signals coming from production. Highly complex, becoming more complex as we go forward. But the opposite is sort of true for the world of SaaS apps and low code, where those vendors are working really hard to make them more and more predictable and more usable by non-technical users or by technical users. So a variety of people are in there creating applications and testing them, but they're fundamentally about business processes, making sure that they stay consistent over time. And Autonomic is the ideal tool using AI ML to ensure that that world has the appropriate testing tool for the problem at hand.
You know, one of the things that excites me about this whole motion is that it also gives us a chance to run in parallel this entire AI/ML experiment, if you will, in that we know it works for business applications, but we can continue to develop it and see how much of that can also come across and help us in the SDLC, right? I mean, it's an interesting opportunity to bring the two together, and it's something I know you and I've talked about a lot. You know, it's not identical to, but it's parallel to different ways of thinking about development on web and mobile. So just like SDLC is a little different from business app quality, similarly, there's been over the years just a lack of recognition that web development and mobile development really are pretty fundamentally different. And that also extends into the quality space. And so there are specific changes around the number of people who are involved, in the way in which applications are distributed, in the way in which applications are tested, whether you use emulators and simulators followed by devices. But I think at root, the big difference between the two is that on the web side, we see essentially a collapsing of environments. Yes, there are a couple of operating systems, but really the number of browsers seems to be consolidating at minimum in how they operate. And so they're becoming much more similar to one another. And in many cases, they're based on Chrome, but not all cases. But certainly, Apple with Safari and Google with Chrome are making sure to create these consistent patterns. But the same is certainly not true of Android and iOS. And it's not really true of all the different devices in the Android world. And it's also the case that any machine running a browser with a common operating system is identical to any other machine of the same operating system running the same browser. They're interchangeable. But in the device world, they're not interchangeable because the environment changes. And there are applications that need to be tested in situ, right? Do you have a tablet that's going to sit inside of a store where there's a shadow that comes across it? That's going to be a very different circumstance than a tablet that's out in sunlight versus a tablet that's sitting in someone's room. So being in the right situation is also important. Right now, we have these large device farms, which is fantastic, and we have emulators and simulators. But one thing that TestFairy does is it allows you to combine both in situ testing, where you can actually put it into the hands of users, and you can really change that life cycle of validation and get some of the same loops moving as you might get if you were to take a web application and put code directly into production, which is not always possible on the mobile side, where you have intermediaries like the App Store that are going to limit your distribution model. So TestFairy is more than just a couple capabilities. It's actually expanding the entire perspective of how you can run mobile quality into a whole new area and bring in, again, more personas, more people into this DevOps test tool chain that we're really building here around collaboration.
Yeah, along those lines, you mentioned how web development and mobile development are just different. I think a lot of what happened was mobile development just grew up a little bit later. Web development was a little bit longer, right? And mobile development's newer, and it just grew up differently with its own cultural differences. Mobile developers really want to have quick feedback loops with real users, partially because, as you mentioned, there's so many devices and in situ differences, et cetera. There's just a long tail of edge cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just great to have that feedback loop, that quick reaction. But of course, you also need the really broad testing and the deep testing with mobile that we get with real device clouds and emulators and simulators. And one of the things that's really exciting is putting those two together. The genius of SDK, like any other error reporting system, is of test fair, is that it has an SDK for error reporting, right? And when you put an SDK into an app, and then you deploy that app onto our RDC or onto our MUSIM, now you get deeper introspection into that app, and you kind of get the best of both worlds. And that's pretty exciting. And again, more collaboration amongst multiple personas and just better signal, better quality.
It's also interesting because, within the native app space, you see all of those applications that are just heavily dependent on APIs. And the pace of change with the mobile app doesn't match the pace of change in a web app. So quite often in the web application, an API gets updated, but at the same time, all the dependent services or user interface components also get updated because it's a batch set and you put it together into production. But with a native app, you have this long tail of versions that are sitting out in the world. And so when the API gets updated, you need to know that all those versions are still working, which is another reason why API Fortress was so important for us, because there's that heavy dependence. And in many respects, I think all of us would agree API testing is critical, but there's just a higher level of awareness within the mobile community, including going all the way back to Facebook with GraphQL and changing in the way in which a native app actually does communicate. And then at the same time, there's the whole gaming world on mobile. So, and the gaming world in mobile works differently because you have to collect your errors and you have to capture your errors in a different model. And that's something that TestFairy does really well by sitting underneath the covers, so to speak. It's not so much about finding and clicking buttons. It's about a safety net.
Yeah.
It's about providing that safety net so you can just go ahead and do a build, put it out for playtest or experiment with it, and then collect at the bottom, well, what dropped out and how do we respond to those and how do I connect that back to the developer? So it's a lot of pretty exciting motion for us, right? We've got the web, we've got mobile, we have now business applications that we can test. We're really kind of bringing it all together in this DevOps test tool chain, this whole collaboration platform. Any other parting thoughts, John?
Well, Matt, we've talked about a variety of tools that Sauce has invested in this year, a variety of signals. Of course, we've always been known as the Selenium company.
Yeah.
Now we're becoming framework agnostic, such that any testing framework we're open to. I think what we're seeing is, yes, the quality world is in a state of flux, but it's an and, it's not an or.
Yeah.
More. And this is what happens in technology. As complexity increases, you bring in more tools, et cetera. And I think our job is to bring those signals together, make sense of them, extract higher value through analytics and AI ML over time from the collected signals, right? And I think that's our responsibility and our path. And looking forward to doing that over the next couple of years together with you.
Great point. I'm looking forward to it.